Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
You can classify objects in three: fragile, robust, antifragile. Unlike risk, you can measure fragility. I can measure the fragility of the coffee cup. I cannot figure out, I can have comparative fragility measures. I can't predict an event in complex systems. If you are fragile, you're disproportionately more harmed by a large event than a small event. Let's assume I smash my car against the wall at 50 miles per hour. I'm harmed a lot more than if I smash it 50 times at 1 mile per hour. You agree? Every incremental mile per hour harms me more than the previous one. That's the definition of fragility as acceleration. And when we're going to talk about size, why projects of 100 million pounds are harmed by a lot more by unexpected events than small, that will flow from this graph. This book is organized around 6 books, and it's written in a way for nobody to be able to figure out what the contents of a chapter from the title. Part 1, I talk about biological systems and systems where you have the fragile harmed by being fragile, but the system gains from the fragility of individual components. Like restaurant business is fragile, but the system is good. And I have an anti-Darwinistic stance against something called the naturalistic fallacy, is that nature is not moral. But who you have to rescue is the very weak. To encourage risk-taking on the part of entrepreneurs because the system needs them. You guys got here because of entrepreneurs, not because of bonus earners and bureaucrats, and not thanks to bankers, by the way, all right? So you didn't get here, you didn't start the Industrial Revolution with that. Risk takers who have small downside, big upside. Book 2, I talk about interventionism. And in fact, the libertarians hate it, and the anti-libertarians hate it, the status, because in fact what I say is we tend to micromanage things, as Mr. Gordon Brown has done brilliantly. Book 3, about prediction of system, and I introduce the idea of upside. If a system has anything that has more upside than downside, I ground it in Stoical philosophy because Seneca figured it out. If you have more upside than downside, you're antifragile. You're convex. If you have more downside than upside in any action, you're fragile. And Seneca figured it out with his own emotion. He said, I'm very wealthy. I have no upside from money, but if money is taken away from me, I'm harmed. I'm going to change it by forcing myself to become poor every morning. You wake up, you write off all your possessions, so therefore nobody can take anything away from me. I'm robust now. That's sort of the idea of anti-fragility is in the reinterpretation of Seneca. If you read them without reading the commentators, and only a lady, I think, in the UK, Ms. Graver, figured it out, okay? That she read Seneca without reading the commentators, but being Stoic doesn't mean being a vegetable. It means enjoy not having downside from adverse events, but benefiting from positive events. Book 4, I go into something nobody likes, thanks to Terence Keeley. Terence Keeley is someone who studied the Industrial Revolution and figured out something that nobody would say at the time, which is that science doesn't drive technology, but technology comes from science. Jet engine, invented by some theoretician, physicist. No, you look at history, engineers figured it out, all out. Someone came and put it in a book, and engineers don't write books, unfortunately. So I call it lecturing birds how to fly. Birds don't write books on aerodynamics, so we have the illusion, that you lecture a bird how to fly, it flies, you claim credit for it. Now comes to, this is a massively important point linked to something that likes volatility. Your body loves randomness. And there's a way to identify it. Is instead of having a dose of 100 milligrams or something, right? Name whatever you want, today and tomorrow. You had 0 today and 200 tomorrow. Instead of having 100 each day, you benefit from it, then you have this more upside than downside curve. And the same one we used for fragility applies to your body. That your body needs stressors. Effectively, you go to the gym, you need stressors. This is fragility. You look at this as variation of the banking system, mostly with positives and then a big negative. The problem is, during the positive, the bankers made the bonuses, no? During the negative, who paid for them? You pay taxes? An architect should be punished when the house crumbles on the owner, because that removes the incentive of the architect to hide risk in a foundation. And no inspector will know more than the architect. This asymmetry is shocking. At no point in time in history have we had more people with taking the upside at the expense of others. That's a byproduct of complexity. Complexity makes it possible. And when you have large states, people at the top living in Washington dealing with a spreadsheet are never harmed by their mistakes. They're not ashamed. The spreadsheet doesn't make you ashamed. In a small commune, you are ashamed. Never ask a doctor what you should do. Ask him what he would do if you were you. You get a different answer. So this is my ethical point. I never talk about what I want people to do. When I say how to live in a world we don't understand, I'm not allowed to tell you what you should be doing. I can only tell you what I have done. So I want to be harmed by my error more than you. Economics have been giving us bullshit models now for a long time. Why? Because they're never harmed by their mistakes. We are harmed. Okay? Predictors are never harmed by their mistakes. This is why I'm against someone telling me what he predicts. I want him to tell me, what do you have in your portfolio? What do you do? All right? That's all I want to do. So thank you very much. I put my watch back.
And Nassim's work, and some of that is covered here, I think really helps us understand why it is that scale has a downside. In policy making, in government procurement, in the way we design our political systems and public services, there's an assumption in Whitehall that big is by and large always best, and that economies of scale are always never apparent. It's the reason why when we were elected, 95% of government contracts, 95% went to companies with more than 250 employees, went to large companies by definition. Scale up these contracts, bunch of small contracts together into one big contract and you'll save money. And Nassim's work helps us understand that whilst you might think you're saving money, maybe on the face of it you are, you're also scaling risk. The risks involved, potentially, particularly with complex projects like IT, scale exponentially. And that's really not something that's understood. It's still the hegemonic view in Whitehall is still big is best. And we see it too in the challenges around breaking up the monolithic school system, moving towards a more localized NHS, a more localized political construct, very, very alien for Whitehall because of this dominant view that big doesn't have downside risks. And Nassim really eloquently and empirically shows why we should be concerned about the hidden risks in size.
It's not, I mean, some projects can be £100 million and be small. Mm. Some projects can be £5 million and be too large. Mm. You see, it depends. If you're in an airplane building business, you scale differently. So this is what, it's relative. For example, it's very strange. When you build bridges, you have that effect because it's a big monolithic project. But when you're building roads, we noticed that you don't have that much scaling because if you make one small mistake at a time. Even if the project is big and you're building a road for 500 miles, you're making one small mistake at a time and you adjust. Right. The idea is not to make big mistakes. The fragility is when your mistakes are small and gains are large, or robustness is when your mistakes are small. And the whole idea is not to make big mistakes.
Right. This idea that any kind of downside is bad. We must iron out the kind of cycle, not realizing that you end up fragilizing a system as a result. Not having a point you often make is not having elections in the Middle East might look like you're creating stability, but the moment something goes wrong, boom. And you know, the effect of a lot of our policy making is about trying to iron out the downside. There's a fantastic statistic, which is that the countries in Europe that have the lowest growth rates over the last 20, 30 years are also the countries with the lowest bankruptcy rates. And you know, we've got to sort of develop a way of looking at the world that acknowledges that sometimes things go wrong, and then that can be the price, or that's part of the reason things also go right. So low bankruptcy rates, low growth rates, maybe counterintuitive. Certainly for policymakers, you're there. Oftentimes, the mindset is stop anything bad going wrong. Nassim's work helps us understand the risks involved, the fragilizing potential implications of that kind of mindset. The final point that we were really moved by and continue to be moved by is this anti-fragility thesis, which is really radical. And one of the ways in which we're trying to embrace that in government is by really getting behind venture capital and angel investment. The groups, the economic categories that most benefit from volatility are equity, early stage equity investing and angel investment. We've introduced, it's been a real fight to do it, what we think are the most generous tax breaks in the world for angel investment. That could easily lead to kind of a political downside for us, because it means people potentially making lots of money on the upside. But it's incredibly important that we embrace that kind of anti-fragility, and that's directly informed by Nassim's work. Similarly to our behavioural insights team, the team in the Cabinet Office trying to harness social psychology and behavioural economics for policymaking, every single thing they do uses randomised controlled trials. And it's low downside risk when something doesn't work, but high upside risk, high upside gain when these randomised trials work out. This idea of really embracing anti-fragility, particularly through rewards for early stage venture capital investment, risk capital, the entrepreneurs that really build our societies.
But also those who fail, you should compensate those who fail. That's the whole point, is that make it respectable to fail.
Right.
People die at war, it's respectable to, you don't say, oh, he's a failure, we're not going to bury him in the prime cemetery because he died at war, compared to this guy who didn't die in war. No, you have more respect for those who fell for the sake of the collective. Well, it's the same thing. People don't realize that the failure of the entrepreneur is a necessary ingredient for economic growth.
Right.
And these are the people who should bail out, not the bankers, to pay themselves bonuses, or in fact do anything but suck up resources.
Something Nassim often says in this context is you can look to Mother Nature for insights, and it's the death of individual. Natural selection depends on.
Or no failure take a benign system like the air travel. Okay, every plane that crashes kills people, but we don't realize that these casualties save lives. We exploit it to the hill. We never let a failure go, without improving the system. So the next probability, the crash drops. However, take banks. The failure of a bank increases the probability of another bank failing. So it means that system is not designed properly to be in accordance with nature. And we have to do something about it, about the size of banks and the contagion between banks. And we have to do something about debt, because debt causes contagions that you don't have in systems that have low level of debt, whether private debt or governmental or bank debt. It becomes an extremely fragile system, and also with some moral implications that are horrible.
You said that if aircraft, you're saying that's a good system of aviation, they learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
The banks don't. But something else that doesn't tends to be governments. I mean, governments are susceptible to great booms and then great crashes too. So is it simply the case that it's physically possible to learn from aviation disasters, but with other spheres of human endeavour, like banking and government, there is no black box, there is no code?
No, but in governments, in fact, there is. When you have, people don't realize something that's looking at us, is that in the middle of Europe, the country that has always worked the best is Switzerland, and doesn't have a government. In fact, it has dictatorial micro-governments at the local level, with your neighbors telling you can't paint this red, all right? And really, you can have a party to late, it's kind of intrusive, but at its micro level. So scale matters, you see?
Right.
So a bottom-up system like Switzerland, where nobody knows the name of the president, is an extremely good system, right? So the problem is the nation-state, top-down nation-state, is a modern invention, very modern, in fact. The French claimed to have it, but they were incompetent at maintaining it because nobody learned French. You see, the Egyptians blew up because they had this, the First Nation state system, top down, like Whitehall controlling the whole of Egypt. They blew it, took no time, contact with outsiders to blow up. So it's a very modern system, and it cannot handle complexity. The system that has the most successful in history, that has been the most successful, is the bottom-up city-state system. So government, I'm not saying how we should have top-down government. The quality of the government when small is much higher than when it's big, and people are penalized by their mistakes. Mayors, from New York City to other cities, are doing vastly better jobs than governments. And it's not because they're more intelligent, it's because their scale allows them to do so.
So the whole concept of central government, do you think, is a bit dodgy?
I think that of large government, top-down, is a bit dodgy. You have to have, it's a matter of scale. You can have central dictatorial, within Kensington. It's the borough, I'm going to be a dictator. You can't chew gum, but Notting Hill.
Johnson have more power here
Exactly.
in London, do
No, and then in Notting Hill they chew gum, and then they compete together. So you have a system of competing city-states as we had in antiquity, under some Pax Romana, to prevent them from thinking of war and engage in commerce. And it works beautifully well. The nation-state is something invented to do war.
The challenge in Whitehall of that kind of thinking is that we tend to think about the inefficiency of a localized system without factoring in the risk involved, the fragilizing nature of a centralized system.
And you see this curve of risk, concavity, is like more asymmetries as you size of, you're fragile when the size of impact of an error matters more, and this is particularly acute when you build bridges, for example, dams, stuff like that, okay? So large banks have this effect, large corporations have this. So you can, but the thing is complexity is making this curve a lot more concave every year. 200 years ago, if you look at cost overruns from size, they were minimal. And I cite here the 100 and some years ago, the Kensington Fair, and how on time to put together something quite complicated and large. But today, because of complexity, you have to be even smaller and smaller because you can be squeezed a lot more, and you need a lot more redundancy buffers than you did before.
This redundancy point, I think, is really interesting. Mother Nature gives us, or many of us, most of us, 2 kidneys, which is an inefficient strategy if you're thinking in terms of optimal efficiency. The reason we have 2 kidneys is you can't predict the future, and you might need a backup kidney.
Exactly.
And again, the way politics tends to work and policymaking tends to work, that kind of redundancy and the kind of resilience that comes from redundancy, from having a bit of spare, is by and large never factored in.
Well, we have a deputy prime minister. I mean, that's the
Yeah, but let me. One thing. Look at the way I measure antifragility is a redundancy buffer in strength. You lift weight, all right? You lift 100 pounds today. Your body will remember that you lifted 100 pounds, and it will not make you fit for 100 pounds in the future. It will make you fit for 105 pounds. You see, it will build in, and this extra 5 pounds is what I measure as antifragility, is overcompensation response. And we don't look at it because we didn't have a word for it, so you can't make a policy out of it. Something doesn't exist. Resilience, if you aim for resilience, you're going to blow up. You see, if you aim for resilience is to be okay, to be safe, you're going to blow up. You have to aim for risk-taking that benefits you more.